Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to give everyone a couple of seconds to get logged in, but hop into the chat box while we're waiting and let us know where you are tuning in from today. Give it a couple minutes to let everyone get settled and logged in, but just let us know where you're watching from. Well, I see Indiana, Menlo Park, everybody. New York, hello. Cool. Well, we will get started because we're a little past our time here. So hi, everyone. I'm Madeline DeVoe. I'm the Content Marketing Manager at iWave. And I'm really excited to welcome you here to our webinar today with CCS Fundraising. So this is fundraising for primary and secondary education, insights on today's philanthropic landscape. So before I hand it over to our presenters, Bob and Danielle today, I just want to go over our housekeeping items. So everyone's on mute or in listen only mode, but if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just hop into that question box and submit your questions there. We will take some time to go over those questions at the end of the presentation, so we'll try to answer as many as we can. And you'll also be getting the recording in a follow-up email later on today. So if you wanted to share this recording with a colleague or watch it again, then you can do that. Just stay tuned to your email for that. So with that, I will hand it over to Danielle and Bob to introduce themselves.
Great, thank you, Madeline. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So as Madeline said, I'm Bob Weston, and I am the practice lead for our independent school work. So I've been with CCS for about 3 years. And prior to CCS, I spent 30 years in independent school as a teacher, as an administrator, associate head of school, fundraiser. So have deep experience in independent school, and that's my focus in my work at CCS. And I'll let Danielle introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Piazza. I am an assistant vice principal at CCS. I have been with the company almost 5 years now, and I am currently working with an independent school here in Morristown, New Jersey. So we are going to kick it off today. We're excited to have you, and we look forward to your questions at the end. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob to get us started.
Great, thank you, Danielle. So just quickly before we start, a word about CCS, about who we are and what we do. So we're a fundraising consulting and campaign management firm. So we help clients with strategic counsel, capital endowment campaigns, leadership giving, assessments, analytics. We've been in business over 70 years, and we operate 14 offices, both nation and worldwide. And in any given year, we partner with about 500, maybe more than 500 nonprofits, of which in any given year, probably 120 to 140 are educational institutions, roughly evenly split between primary and secondary and higher ed. And we employ now upwards of 350 folks. So a fairly large operation, and again, span the nation and the world. And so today, just a quick look at our agenda. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes giving a quick overview of the state of philanthropy generally. And then we're gonna dive in, and Danielle's gonna take us through some giving trends for schools. And then we're gonna talk about some tactics that we have seen play out and have been effective. And then we're gonna open it up for discussion, and then we'll sum it all up. And so with that, just a quick look at the current state of philanthropy. So on this next slide, just to level set us. So in 2019, Americans gave just over $1 billion a day on average, which is an astounding number. And you know, the pie chart to the left is interesting in that nearly 70% of that giving came from individuals. And I draw that point out because when the pandemic hit last year, of course, we were all really concerned about what was going to happen with that individual giving, and quite nervous about that. And so on the right-hand side, you see a chart that Fidelity Charitable did a survey of over 500 leading philanthropists in 2020, and the results were quite promising. So you can see that 50% of folks said they were planning to give the same as they gave in 2019, and 46 said they were going to give notably more. And I think a couple of interesting points about that. So first of all, philanthropy has held up incredibly well through 2020. I think one thing that we know is that the economic impact has been uneven, and those folks with resources have done quite well. So interestingly, I was just reading this morning that there are approximately 650, or in 2019, there were 650 billionaires in the US. And that group of billionaires over 2020 added over $1 trillion in wealth. So that's trillion with a T. So it makes sense that philanthropy, individual philanthropy, would have held up well over the past year. And our data has borne that out. And in a few minutes, we'll talk more specifically about how that's been reflected in the school world. But again, 2020 has turned out to be a much better year philanthropically than I think we all imagined about a year ago. So here, interesting chart on the left. So CCS, we conducted 4 surveys, climate surveys, over the past year, and we surveyed just over 1,000 of the nonprofits that we work with to see how their giving was impacted. And you can see, if you look at the red line at the top left, out of the gate when COVID started, a lot of institutions, a lot of organizations understandably saw giving go down. But interestingly, that number has in fact diminished over time. So what does that mean? So those institutions, those organizations that experienced a decline in giving, that number has gone down over the past year. Well, and makes sense. Conversely, the number of institutions that have seen a rise in giving has gone up. And interesting that these two lines from last May until January are close to intersecting. And in fact, I think if we had more current data into February and March, in fact, these lines would have crossed. So again, 2020 turned out to be a stronger year. Philanthropy rebounded strongly, given came back. And interestingly, the last point on the right-hand slide is that there was a survey done and giving increased. This was a survey done by the Fundraising Effectiveness Project in conjunction with Giving Tuesday. And they recorded an increase of 11% over the past year. And what's curious about this is I just talked about sort of the uber wealthy folks, but interestingly, the largest percentage of increase in this number came from small gifts, less than $250. So of this 11% increase, over 15% of that increase was reflected in gifts of under $250. And I share that because I find that really, frankly, heartwarming and compelling that during a really difficult time, Americans stepped up and they wanted to help. And we've seen this across all sectors. So I think that's a really compelling statistic. I think it shows the power of the work that nonprofits do. And in a couple minutes, Danielle will take us through some school data that reflects that as well in terms of the value proposition and the desire for our donors to support our work. And here I find this slide, again, completely overwhelming and stunning that the global response to COVID and COVID relief has been unprecedented. So in this graph, you can see that in the past year, over $20 billion has been directed toward COVID relief, which dwarfs any amount of charity or charitable giving to other disasters. And of course, we know that this has been a global pandemic, and so it would make sense that it's received this kind of relief. Interestingly, this relief has been split between individuals and corporations. So corporations have accounted for nearly half of this, and then more local organizations, community foundations, individuals have accounted for the balance. But again, I think really encouraging that so many organizations and so many individuals have been so generous over this past year to meet the demands of COVID. And I think you all in schools know certainly very well that philanthropy is going to have to play a continued part in the recovery going forward, and that our schools need to raise money to support increase in financial aid, to provide access, to meet the DEI initiatives that a lot of your schools are undertaking. So philanthropy globally has answered the call, and now more locally is going to have to answer the call going forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to talk more specifically about what we've seen in schools.
All right, thanks, Bob. All right, let's dive in. Let's take a closer look at giving trends in the primary and secondary education sector. Okay, on this slide here, as you can see, it really does dive in to show exactly how important education is to philanthropic minded people, and especially in the high net worth donor sector. Globally, billionaires support education more than any other sector. The global billionaire population grew by 8.5% in 2019, and combined wealth of billionaires outpaced the population growth in 2019, rising by 10.3%, which was equal to $9.4 trillion. And China's billionaire population expanded the most rapidly, though the United States is still home to the largest number of billionaires. And that is very good news for all of us in philanthropy. Okay, we're going to go on to the next slide. Okay, giving to education on a long-term upward trend. So we want to hear from you on this. When we look at this slide, historically, evidence shows us that philanthropy is resilient in times of crisis. Giving to education specifically follows this upward trend. We want to know from you, have you received larger gifts in 2020, 2021 than ever before? Yes, no, or not sure. We're interested to hear from you guys to see if this is the case. So you should be able to vote now.
Yeah, we'll just leave it up there for a moment or two to let everyone pop their answers in.
Thank you. Just another fun fact also is of the philanthropic in the philanthropic industry, 14% of all charitable contributions went to education, amounting to 64 billion. This is a growth of 12% since 2018, which is really incredible. And it really does show that people show up for education and that they are also invested in education, which is all good news for us.
I just ended the poll there, and I'm going to share the results here.
Okay, good results. Excellent. So we have our data right, Bob.
Yeah, and Danielle, if I could just share just very anecdotally that with the nine schools that I'm currently working with who are in a campaign, 5 of those schools have received their largest living gift in their history. So again, I know it's a small sample, but it just reinforces what's on this slide is that, again, people have supported the mission of your schools and understand the value proposition. So that's great to see.
That is also true of the school that I'm working with. They were able to secure a very, very large gift from the same family this year, which was the largest gift in school history. So it is looking very good, even though we are in the midst of a pandemic. So not all things bad. Okay, on to the next slide. Okay, promising forecasts for primary and secondary education. A recent industry report of 40 billion of charitable activity indicates that online fundraising is increasing in popularity for primary and secondary schools. 6.7% increase in 3 years online giving as compared to 5.3 across sectors, which is really impressive. 13.5% of all fundraising came from online donations as compared to 13% across all sectors. $1,278 is the average donation as compared to $737 across sectors. An 8.7% increase in online giving as compared to 21% across all sectors. This is a very exciting time for online giving. I feel that we are starting as a culture of philanthropists starting to move towards online giving. I feel that the next generations are feeling more comfortable with online giving. It is normalized now, and that the generation still exists that likes to give a check or call in with a credit card. But we have moved to this new way of giving, which is incredible because you capture more gifts. Most of the time, gifts are likely to be larger online. And it does save the organizations and the institutions a lot more time in regards to record keeping. Bob, are you finding this also in the world of the 5 schools that you're working with?
Absolutely. Yep. And we'll talk more about the online giving in the virtual environment, but absolutely. Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, median annual giving by source. Annual giving is critical to all schools. The school that I particularly work with has increased their annual giving by almost 72% in the last couple of years, working in a campaign, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But annual giving is critical to all school operations, and everything that the school does depend on an annual basis. Now, when looking at this slide, it was very interesting to me that trustees came out on top. That's wonderful. I'm glad that the sample set from this group of folks are experiencing high participation from trustees, because it is critical to the school. The Independent School Fact report collected from NAIS members provided statistical data on enrollment, admissions, tuition, financial aid, staff, teacher salaries, income expenses, and annual giving, among others. The 2020 data here shows that the median annual giving amount by source has the trustees, as I mentioned, leading in contributions, followed by parents, current parents, which are huge investors in our schools and in the day-to-day, and other constituents, which we unfortunately don't have that broken out for you, but we are excited to see that parents of alum are also, and parent and grandparents are ranked very high in the annual giving sector. Okay, we are going to move on to the next. So as I was speaking of before with capital giving, this is a more tangible outcome for many donors. So with this, when we look at the source of median capital giving by source, we find that organizations or institutions really do benefit tremendously from current parents. They are investors. They are there wanting their children to have the best at the school. So 16,000 is a really high number, and that's pretty incredible that they have come in, and they've come in big. So following them is the parents of alumni, and grandparents, which we like to all see, with trustees following right behind. We're going to put up a poll here, and we want to see have you seen similar giving trends by source at your school when it comes to capital giving? I'll give you guys a few minutes to fill that out.
And feel free to hop into the chat too and let us know if it's been different or very different, why that is. Jump into the chat and let us know. Give it a couple more seconds. You can pop your answers in there.
And this slide does reflect very much so the current client that I have. 2 buildings, one building is fully built within a year, and we have a second building being built within another year. So within 2 years, they will have 2 large facilities on campus, all attributed to mostly current parents. So it's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to see the results of this, because I think that's certainly reflected in the schools that I know. Yeah, and here we go.
Somewhat similar.
Yep, parent giving really outpaces alumni giving, and just interesting to note in terms of our cultivation and stewardship strategies. And I was saying to Danielle yesterday, I wonder if this is more a reflection of how people parent or how our schools operate. But it's an interesting data point and something to keep in mind. And sorry, Danielle, just one more point about this though. It's good news, but again, what it points to is that parents are under tremendous pressure, financial pressure. We ask them to write the check for tuition, and then we ask for their philanthropy on top of that. And so we're fortunate that they're answering the call, but I think you all experience the real pressure that that puts on families. And again, we'll be curious to know once we get to the discussion portion, how true this is in terms of the number of families who are requesting financial assistance now. And again, anecdotally, I know from the schools I work with, that number has gone up a lot. And so there's real pressure on financial aid. At the same time, this giving is coming from parents. So just an interesting data point and something we'll want to talk a little bit more about.
Absolutely. All right, I think we're good to go to the next slide. Perfect. Okay. Fewer donors, larger gifts. For decades, donors have noted a decrease in the number of donors, yet increase in funding. This year, the trend continues. In this table, you will see the overall participation decreases across all categories with some increases in alumni and grandparent giving. Moderate increases in giving are among parents and faculty, while trustees decreased gift amount overall. So what we're seeing is that people are still giving, they're giving larger gifts, but we're not seeing as many gifts and fewer donors at this time. I think we talked yesterday briefly, Bob and I, about, this pandemic has been good for some financially and not good for others. So it depends on which bracket you fall into, but people that have done well during this time have been very generous, if anything, overly generous, and people that have struggled, may not have given as much, but have participated. Bob, would you say that that's pretty true?
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, perfect. We're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, expectations vary by fundraising program. Now, this was very interesting to me. When we researched this and looked at this as a group before presenting to you all, this was done back in January. So looking at this now, you will see that out of more than 1,000 organizations between last spring and January of this year included hundreds of responses from individuals representing the education sector. That's where we gathered this data from. You'll see the data reference in this and then the following slide. So basically here, as you can see, major gifts coming on top. People are not worried about major giving. They're not worried about their annual appeal. Foundations, it's still in the 23%. People are a little unsure. Maybe it's the same giving. But what I found to be very interesting, because it was taken in January, is the special events category here, second to the bottom. 73% of people that responded were concerned that the revenue from these events would decrease. So now, being that we are in April and the world is a little bit different and has changed due to the vaccinations and things loosening a little bit, does everyone feel that that 73% is still true? So what we ask you to do with this poll is we want to know, do you anticipate a change in fundraising results for special events during the remainder of 2021 compared with 2022? So do you think it will increase? Do you think it will decrease or stay the same? And please feel free to put in the chat also, because we do want to hear from you what your thought is on this. I know with my current clients, they were able to successfully do in 2020 their online annual gala, and it actually raised more than they did in 2019. And this year they are prepared to do it again online with the hopes that it raises exactly the same as 2020 or if not more. So I'm curious to see what people think.
And you should see the results on the screen.
Increase, yay. So everybody is moving towards being more optimistic. Stay the same, pretty good, 27%. So no one really feels that they will decrease too much, which is wonderful news. And I do feel this once people are able to come out in person, still probably wearing masks, but participating, having outdoor events, being more active in this space. I do feel that special events will come back, and they'll come back strong.
And Danielle, I'll be curious when, again, in discussion, if folks on the call feel like the increase is coming from just greater generosity and people answering the call because of the very nature of the current environment? Or is there a bit of cost savings in that number as well, right? So the virtual events cost far less to put on than your gala or what have you. So I'll be curious to know if people are just answering that call and being more generous, or if part of that increase is also a cost savings.
Absolutely, Bob. 3 factors support us. Okay, let's see what Lynn says. Okay, 3 factors supporting an increase for us. Okay. All right. So I think it's safe to move. Oh, here we go. Hang on, it's coming through. Desire to get together, 100%. We are feeling that at my current clients. They cannot wait to have their prom. Socially distanced promming. Interesting. Okay, I'm waiting for the other 2 factors before we move on. Strong cause, COVID relief, excellent. Great stewarding and communication to donors there. We got one more. Savings, Bob, you came in. Savings on expenses. Have to worry about the banquet hall or the dinner, which is great. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Lynn, for sharing. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk through some more interesting facts that we have for you all.
Great, thanks, Danielle. So just want to talk through some specific, some tactics in what we've seen. So in terms of source of support, and this won't surprise any of you, current donors and stakeholders are the lion's share of the folks who have been supportive in the past year. Frankly, I only shared this slide not as a data point in terms of giving, but frankly more to remind you the importance of stewardship. I think during a time that's challenging, I think oftentimes we want to bring new donors to the conversation. And while of course we want to, it's important to take care of those who are closest to us. So I think where schools have responded really well during COVID is in their communication. You know, in some respects, COVID has provided an opportunity to communicate more, and schools have done that really well. And I think it's reflected in this, where those who are closest to the school have remained loyal and have been generous. And so when you look at 80% of the current donors and stakeholders, it makes sense. But I offer this as a reminder of the importance of stewardship in this work as well. And then, of course, the method of donor engagement. And I think, of course, over the past year, and you've probably been on countless webinars that have talked about virtual engagement, and we're going to talk about it a little bit now, that, you know, being old school and picking up the phone and checking in with people and calling has proven really effective. And I think, of course, when we haven't been able to be together in person, you know, the phone has been a lifeline for a lot of folks, as has Zoom. And so, you know, I think interestingly, schools have done a better job transitioning to the virtual environment than a lot of nonprofits, simply because of your educational work and your mission, and the fact that in terms of your pedagogy and curriculum, you've had to make that transition. And I think that's been reflected in terms of how you've handled it in terms of fundraising. But and we'll talk a bit more about this, but the virtual briefings, the virtual solicitations have been effective and have gone well. So if you haven't done that yet, or you're tentative, I would say jump in. And I think anecdotally on the call today, folks would and urge you to share your success stories. But you know, schools have engaged in these solicitations and engaged major donors over Zoom quite effectively. And here you go. So so in our survey, you know, we had 213 schools respond. Nearly 60% of those schools had conducted a major gift solicitation virtually, either by phone or via Zoom or some other computer method, and had done so effectively. And again, it makes sense, right? And this has probably been your experience. People are longing for that connection, so they're looking for that engagement. People are more available. You know, everybody's been at home for a long time, and so, you know, without having to travel to see people, it's easier to access them. So again, across all of our schools, we've seen a great deal of success in this virtual environment. It's not our preferred method. So I don't think it's going to last necessarily. I think we long for the time when we can sit together and have real conversation. But in the absence of that, the virtual environment has proven very effective. So again, for those of you who may be on the right-hand side, and it may also be a function of, if you're on the right-hand side, maybe you're not currently in a campaign and you're not soliciting major gifts, but again, would encourage you to make that leap if you haven't, because donors have been receptive and the results have been quite positive. So interesting when we talk to schools at the beginning of the pandemic who were in campaigns, and our strong recommendation was not to put it on hold or to cancel it. Again, totally understandable in terms of why, and again, needing to be respectful and mindful of everybody's different situation in terms of geography, in terms of demographic, in terms of the local economy. But I think those schools that pressed on with their campaigns found that they've been very effective. And even 15% of schools we're working with or we surveyed started campaigns during this past year. And so I share this slide because, again, I wouldn't, if you're not in a campaign, you're thinking about a campaign, I wouldn't rule out now as an appropriate time to start it. Again, the value proposition has held up well. People want to be helpful. They believe in the mission, and they will support it. So if you've been tentative or reluctant to start a campaign, give that some thought, because I think the schools that we've surveyed and worked with have found great success pressing forward. And again, this is just reiterating what we've talked a little bit about, but I think it really interesting that 63% of those folks we talked to in these surveys exceeded goals in virtual fundraising events, individual solicitations, other kinds of events. But again, that should give confidence to all of you in terms of thinking about leveraging that virtual environment to fundraise and to hold events. And again, when I look to the right, only 6% experienced significantly below meeting their goal. So again, I think there are probably extenuating circumstances, but again, I find this really encouraging about the success of these virtual events and the virtual environment to solicit. So I'm going to take a breath and pause, and would love to open it up for discussion.
Awesome, thanks. We don't have a whole lot of questions in here, so I will encourage you to hop into the chat, hop into the question box. We've still got 10 minutes here, but I'll start with a few to get the ball rolling, and we'll go from there. So you touched on this, but has the nature of mixed requests for donors been affected by COVID and the increased online engagement, or is it more important to focus on the impact these new transitions have on major gifts?
So I'm going to ask you to repeat the question.
Yeah, it's a long one. Has the nature of mixed requests for donors been affected by COVID and the increased online engagement, or is it more important to focus the impact of these new transitions have on major gifts?
So Danielle, I'll hop in, and if I understand the question. So I think to the first part of the question, in terms of mixed requests, I would say that we've seen a lot more requests be comprehensive in terms of making sure we're protecting the annual fund and that operating budget, because that's again, that's immediate, and that's so important to the daily functioning of the school. So I would say a lot more blended requests in terms of annual, maybe capital, and endowment. And again, there's been a real focus on endowment giving, not simply, but primarily to build financial aid resources. So if I have it right, we've seen a lot more blended asks in terms of a comprehensive effort. And but I think there was a second part that was more focused on the virtual aspect.
Yeah, that was sort of how have the nature of these changed because of the online engagement, and then is it more to focus on that, like those new transitions of asks, or how they have an effect on major gifts, I guess? That's how I'm interpreting the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to jump in here, Bob? Because this is my
Yeah.
day.
Sure.
Okay. The nature of the online asks have, in my experience, have not affected major asks. If anything, they've been a very smooth transition, very personal, the opposite of what you would think of being being on Zoom and seeing the people just like we are doing right now. It's almost like you're in person. The campaign that I'm currently working on has been very successful. They've raised almost 10.8 million this year, this fiscal year, all online with virtual major asks. So I do encourage you to take the temperature of your donors, make sure that they're comfortable with this type of ask. And then I encourage you to jump in, because it seems scary at first, but this is where we are, and we have to be adaptable and flexible in order to meet goals. And once you've gotten your feet wet, it's really not as bad. And donors actually appreciate it. They don't have to drive anywhere. They don't have to take the time that it takes to do the driving, or the in-person lasts a little bit longer usually than online. So that's been my experience so far. Bob, I don't know if you've had similar.
Yes, it's true. I think the only thing I would add, and I find it interesting, is that I think because everybody had to transition to that virtual environment quickly, folks have done that really thoughtfully. And so I think the conversations, the briefings, the solicitations have been really well choreographed and well planned. And I think because of that, the results have been great. And so I just think there's been a thoughtfulness to pivoting, and I think and that has provided, I think, the opportunity to be really even more thoughtful about how we're going to present our case to our donors, and how to make that case for support. And again, and I'll say more in a minute, but I also think the opportunity that we have right now is that the need for support and the value of that support has never been clearer. So I think that that has been, I think, a big difference in terms of how donors have responded to those major gift requests.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. I guess another question that we can kind of go back to is a little bit more about the Philanthropic Climate Survey reports that CCS does. Do you want to give us sort of a breakdown of how many people that you speak to get these numbers and these stats?
Sure. Well, I think if we went back a couple slides, so I think we survey them, and I think the universe of nonprofits was about 1,100, and it varied survey to survey. But I think on average it was over 1,000 organizations and institutions. And in terms of schools, in terms of primary and secondary school, I think the number was just over 200. So a fairly good group, and a diverse group geographically as well. And certainly size of institution. So again, not exhaustive, but I think a good representative group.
Yeah, awesome. And I didn't mention at the beginning, but we will be sharing the link to download that report in the follow-up email with this recording as well.
Great. Yeah, we'd love to give everyone access to those reports.
We do have a pretty quiet group here today. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us after. But I think I'll pass it over to Bob and Danielle for our final send-off. That's right. We're just going to get the slides back up.
Sure. So, and Danielle, I'll start, and feel free to hop in. I'm not going to belabor the point about the virtual events. We've talked about that, but don't be shy. Jump in, leverage that technology, leverage the opportunity, and know that other schools have had real success. Again, I mentioned this. COVID has provided an opportunity to reaffirm your value proposition. This to me is the most important takeaway. Over the past year, independent schools have responded really well, and they've responded in a couple different ways. If they've had to transition to remote learning, they've done that effectively. Many of your schools have offered a hybrid. many of your schools have gone to great lengths to meet safely in person, and families have appreciated that. They have valued that. And any of us who have spent the last year with our kids at home know the challenges of that on a daily basis. And I think independent schools have done a really great job, what I'll call protecting the educational integrity of the experience, that academic experience. So the value proposition is clear. I think anecdotally too, I think it depends on geography, but I think nationally, applications to independent schools are up, as are financial aid requests. But again, the value is there and people see it. I think that this next one is important. You know, I think resources are limited, but I think to the extent that you can take time as you close out your school year to really look carefully at your data, to see who your donors are, to see where the giving is coming from, to do some analysis, to really help you plan for next year. You know, we're big proponents of data-driven decisions and inquiry. And so to the extent that you have the resources and the time, get inside your data, really do an analysis of giving. And this fourth one, of course, should always apply, and that is show your donors appreciation. Stewardship, and I mentioned it, you know, in the presentation, stewardship is everything. And I think so often we're focused on asking for that gift, and that becomes our focus. But the reality is that moment of asking and receiving is just that. It's a moment in a relationship that is much deeper and much more important. And so stewarding your donors and showing appreciation, of course, is the most important cultivation to that next gift. So Danielle, if you want to hop
Sure.
into these last ones.
Sure. I just wanted to, you know, concentrate a little bit more on stewardship as well, because when COVID did hit last year, my client did panic a little bit and they weren't sure what to do. Should we stop asking? Should we stop the campaign? What should we do? Should we put everything on hold? And my suggestion immediately was like, no, we're not going to put anything on hold. We're going to steward your donors for the next 6 weeks. And what that meant was phone calls, that meant stewardship reports, impact reports, meeting with people, check-ins, making sure people were okay. And I think that went over really, really well for my client. And I'm sure many of you did the same. And people just needed people at that time, and it worked really well. And they were able to recover and start doing asks within, you know, the early May. And then the summer was the busiest summer they've ever had. They raised a lot of money, and they did focus on major gifts. They were not afraid of that, as well as their annual fund with that blended gift ask. And they demonstrated what their impact was. They were always showing how they were doing. We had many campaign town halls, and we still are having one. We have one every 3 months just to show all donors and campaign leadership how important it is to show impact. And then lastly, learn, you know, lean into the hybrid models, be adaptable, come up with new ideas. The more creative you are, we have found that the more creative institutions have been, the more successful they've been in fundraising, and that donors have adapted as well and have actually been intrigued and excited to do these different ways of giving and being stewarded and engaged. So we encourage you to really embrace this time, take away from it what you may and leave the rest behind. But I think good things are on the horizon, and we hope that you all keep positive and things are starting to turn a corner, which is great. And I think that is.
Thanks, Danielle. And so as Madeline mentioned, so feel free to visit our website. You can access our surveys here. And please know we're always available to answer questions or to provide data or to be a resource. You know, so excited to work in the independent school sector. So much believe in the work that you all do. So anything that I and we can do to support that work, I'm happy to do that. So on behalf of Danielle and me, I want to thank you for joining us and thank iWave for this opportunity.
Yeah, and big thank you from us at iWave for this awesome and informative presentation. Like I said, stay tuned for the webinar recording, and we'll also link to download this report. And yeah, thank you so much for attending, and thank you to you for the wonderful presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Madeline.
Thank you.
All righty.
Take care.
Bye-bye.